The grand mahogany clock in the marble-clad hallway of the Richmond County Courthouse struck 9, its deep, resonant chimes reverberating through the polished corridors like a solemn heartbeat. Each toll seemed to carry the weight of justice, or its absence echoing off the towering columns and high ceilings of the historic building. Courtroom 5, nestled at the heart of the courthouse, buzzed with anticipation. Lawyers adjusted their ties, clerks shuffled papers, and spectators whispered. In the gallery, their murmurs blending with the faint hum of the air conditioning. It was April 26, 2025, and another day of dispensing what Judge William Bill Carter called order was about to begin. At 58. Judge Carter was a fixture in Richmond's legal landscape, his reputation as unyielding as the gavel he wielded. Seated behind the elevated mahogany bench, he straightened his black robe, the fabric crisp against his broad shoulders, and adjusted the gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed, and his sharp gray eyes scanned the courtroom with a predatory precision honed by 2 decades on the bench. Carter was known for his ruthless efficiency, his rulings as swift and cutting as his tongue. To him, the law was a machine, and he was its unflinching operator. Yet, beneath his polished exterior, there was a hardness, a tendency to favor those with wealth or status that had quietly tainted his legacy. Next case. Carter's voice boomed, slicing through the low hum of the courtroom. The bailiff, Michael Mike Thompson, a stocky man with a weathered face and a decade of courthouse service, echoed the call. Case number 52841, State versus Edward Harper. Charge of criminal trespassing, 3rd degree. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and all eyes turned to the figure shuffling forward. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery as Edward Harper appeared, his presence a stark contrast to the grandeur of the quoted murmur of the grandeur of the gallery as Edward Harper appeared. His presence a stark contrast to the grandeur of the grandeur of the grandeur of the nature of the dards or the grandeur of Harker Tar appeared. His presence a stark contrast to the grandeur of the age room. At first glance, he seemed to be in his mid-70s. His thin frame stooped beneath a faded flannel shirt that hung loosely on his shoulders. His jeans, once dark blue, had faded to a mottled gray, frayed at the cuffs where they met scuffed. Work boots. A warm baseball cap, which he respectfully removed as he approached the defendant's table, revealed a shock of white hair sticking out in unruly tufts. His hands, calloused and weathered, clasped the cap tightly, betraying a quiet dignity despite his disheveled appearance. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed as he studied the man before him. The patched elbows of Edward's jacket, the threadbare collar of his shirt, the faint stains on his jeans all painted a picture Carter had seen countless times. A drifter, a vagrant, someone who existed on society's margins. The judge's lips curled slightly, a reflex of disdain he barely bothered to conceal. To him, Edward Harper was just another case to dispatch, another clog in the judicial machine. Mr. Harper, Carter began, his voice laced with a weary contempt. It says here you were caught trespassing on the grounds of Lakeside Manor. Care to explain yourself? Edward looked up, his bright blue eyes startlingly clear in his weathered face, a spark of intelligence that seemed out of place in his humble guise. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but gravelly with age. I was sitting by the lake on the property. I used to fish there as a boy. The judge flipped through the case file, his movements theatrical, as if to underscore his annoyance. It also says this is your second offense for trespassing in the last 6 months. The previous incident was at Riverwood Country Club, correct? That's right, Your Honor, Edward replied, unflinched. They've a fine garden there. A few titters of laughter broke out in the gallery, quickly silenced by Carter's icy glare. Do you find this amusing, Mr. Harper? His voice dropped to a dangerous octave, each word a blade. "Because I assure you, this court does not. You're wasting time that could be spent on matters of actual importance." Edward stood quietly, hands folded in front of him, his expression serene despite the judge's growing irritation. The contrast was striking. Carter's commanding presence versus Edward's unassuming calm, like a storm raging against a still. "Lake, where's your attorney, Mr. Harper?" Carter asked, scanning the courtroom with exaggerated exasperation. "I don't have one, Your Honor," Edward said simply. Carter removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Of course. You don't." He replaced the glasses and leaned forward, his tone dripping with mockery. "Let me guess, you couldn't afford one?" "I chose not to hire one for today's hearing," Edward replied, his voice unwavering. The judge's eyebrows shot up. "You chose not to, Mr. Harper? Do you understand the charge against you? Do you understand that repeated offenses could land you in jail?" "I understand the law quite well, Your Honor," Edward said, with a slight nod. Something about the old man's composure. His refusal to cower seemed to grate on Carter's nerves. He was accustomed to defendants trembling before him, not standing with such quiet dignity. "I see," Carter said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "A legal scholar, are we? Tell me, Mr. Harper, if you're so well versed in the law, why do you insist on breaking it?" Edward paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't believe I was harming anyone, Your Honor." The judge's voice thundered across the courtroom, causing several spectators to flinch. "That's not for you to decide. The law isn't a menu where you pick and choose what suits your fancy." Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Lee, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s, shifted uncomfortably at the prosecution table. Her files were neatly organized, but her expression betrayed a flicker of unease at Carter's tone. She remained silent, though her fingers tightened around her pen. In the gallery, a young woman, Emily Brooks, a third-year law student clerking for Carter, scribbled notes furiously, her brow furrowed. Her conservative blazer and legal pad marked her as an observer, but her eyes held a quiet intensity, as if she were cataloging more than just the proceedings. As the judge's tirade continued, Edward's thoughts drifted, pulling him back to a memory that had shaped this moment. 10 years ago, he had stood in a different courthouse, not as a defendant, but as a silent observer. He had watched a homeless man, trembling and unrepresented, sentenced harshly for a minor theft, while a wealthy executive in the next case walked free with a slap on the wrist. The injustice had seared itself into Edward's mind, a catalyst for what he now called his social experiments. Edward Harper was no ordinary man. He was the founder of Harper Innovations, a tech empire worth billions, built from his days as a NASA engineer during the Apollo program. His 16 patents had revolutionized telecommunications, and his name graced the boards of 7 Fortune 500 companies. Yet, twice a year, he shed his tailored suits for threadbare clothes, leaving behind his penthouse to live as someone with nothing, no money, no influence, no identity. It was a ritual born of a promise to his father, a groundskeeper at Lakeside Manor, who had taught him that true character was revealed in how you treated those who could offer you nothing in return. 6 months ago, Edward had purchased Lakeside Manor through a holding company, driven by nostalgia for the Sundays he'd spent fishing with his father on its serene lake. The estate, now a gated enclave for Richmond's elite, held memories that anchored him. But this experiment was different. He had been arrested once before at Riverwood Country Club, another property he quietly owned. That time, he'd walked away with a warning. This time, he'd chosen to let the system run its course, to see how far its biases would carry him. The risk was higher. A prior offense meant jail time was a real possibility, but Edward was prepared. He wanted the world to see what he already knew. Justice was often a privilege, not a right. Back in the courtroom, Carter's voice snapped Edward out of his reverie. "I'm curious, Mr. Harper," the judge said, leaning back in his high-backed chair, his tone now performative, as if addressing the entire room. "What do you do for a living? Or are you retired, living off the generosity of taxpayers?" Edward's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile. "I keep myself occupied with various interests, Your Honor," Carter scoffed. "Various interests, I see. And these interests include trespassing on private property and clogging up my courtroom." "I apologize for any inconvenience I've caused," Edward said, his voice carrying a sincerity that seemed to irritate Carter further. "Inconvenience?" The judge's voice rose, his face flushing. "Mr. Harper, it costs thousands of dollars to process cases like yours, money that could be spent on schools, roads, or hospitals. Do you understand that? You're not just inconveniencing me. You're burdening society." Edward absorbed the verbal onslaught without flinching, his calm demeanor a silent rebuke to Carter's bluster. The judge's words hung in the air, heavy with assumption and disdain. To Carter, Edward was a nobody, a man whose worn clothes and stooped posture marked him as insignificant. But Edward's piercing blue eyes told a different story, one the judge was too blind to see. As Carter prepared to continue his lecture, Edward stood quietly, his hands still clasped around his cap. The courtroom held its breath, sensing the tension between the two men, one wielding power, the other hiding it. Somewhere in the gallery, Emily Brooks stopped writing, her pen hovering over her notepad. She glanced at Edward, her intuition whispering that there was more to this old man than met the eye. Outside, the world spun on, unaware that the events unfolding in Courtroom Five were about to ripple far beyond its marble walls. The air in Courtroom 5 of the Richmond County Courthouse grew heavier, as if the weight of Judge William Bill Carter's indignation had thickened the atmosphere. The polished mahogany paneling and high ceilings, meant to inspire awe, seemed to shrink under the judge's commanding presence. At the defendant's table, Edward Harper stood quietly, his faded flannel shirt and frayed jeans a stark contrast to the pristine order of the room. His blue eyes, sharp and unyielding, met Carter's gaze without flinching, a silent challenge that only fueled the judge's ire. Carter leaned forward, his gold-rimmed glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Harper," he said, his voice a blade honed by years of authority, "you stand here accused of trespassing on the grounds of Lakeside Manor, a private estate. This isn't your first offense, is it?" "No, Your Honor," Edward replied, his gravelly voice steady. "I was cited for trespassing at Riverwood Country Club 6 months ago." The judge's lips curled into a sneer. "Riverwood Country Club, Lakeside Manor. You seem to have a penchant for wandering onto properties that don't belong to you. Care to enlighten this court as to why?" Edward's hands, still clutching his worn baseball cap, tightened slightly. "I meant no harm, Your Honor. The lake at Lakeside Manor. I used to fish there with my father when I was a boy. It holds memories." Carter flipped through the case file with exaggerated exasperation, his fingers snapping against the pages. "Memories," he repeated, the word dripping with mockery. "Do you think nostalgia gives you the right to break the law? To intrude on private property?" A few spectators in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, their whispers barely audible. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Lee, seated at the prosecution table, glanced up from her files, her brow furrowing at Carter's tone. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers hesitating over her notes. At the back of the room, Emily Brooks, the third-year law student clerking for Carter, scribbled furiously in her legal pad, her expression troubled. Bailiff Mike Thompson stood near the defendant's table, his face a mask of professionalism, though his eyes flickered with curiosity toward Edward. "I don't believe I was breaking the law in spirit, Your Honor," Edward said, his voice calm but firm. "I was only sitting by the lake, not causing damage or disturbance. Carter's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. The law isn't a buffet, Mr. Harper. You don't get to pick and choose what feels right to you. Lakeside. Manor is private property, and you had no business being there. Nor at Riverwood Country Club, for that matter. He leaned back, folding his arms. What do you do, Mr. Harper? Are you employed, or do you simply wander from one trespass to the next? Edward's lips twitched, a faint smile that seemed to irritate Carter further. I keep myself occupied with various interests, Your Honor. The judge scoffed, his voice rising. Various interests? That's a conveniently vague answer. Let me guess, you're retired, living off whatever scraps you can scrape together, and you think the world owes you a free pass to loiter wherever you please. The gallery stirred, a low murmur spreading. Jennifer Lee's pen froze mid-sentence, and Emily's head snapped up, her pen pausing over her notepad. Edward, however, remained unruffled, his posture straight despite his stooped appearance. I've worked all my life, Your Honor, he said. I still do in my own way. In your own way, Carter echoed, his sarcasm cutting through the room. And what way is that? Professional trespasser? Nostalgic nuisance? He gestured at Edward's clothes, his voice laced with disdain. Look at yourself. Patched jacket, worn-out jeans. Is this how you present yourself to the world? There are shelters, Mr. Harper, programs to help people in your situation. Yet here you are, wasting this court's time. Edward's eyes gleamed with something unreadable amusement, perhaps, or quiet resolve. You assume much about me, Your Honor, he said softly. I assume nothing, Carter snapped. I observe. And what I observe is a man who's made a habit of disregarding the law. Do you know what it costs to process cases like yours? Thousands of taxpayer dollars diverted from schools, roads, public services, all because you can't respect boundaries. Asterisk. The judge's voice grew louder, his face flushing as he warmed to his lecture. I've seen men like you before, Mr. Harper. Men who think they're above the rules, who wander onto private property because of some misguided sense of entitlement. Are you bored? Seeking attention? Or just too stubborn to follow the laws the rest of us live by? Edward absorbed the verbal lashing without reaction, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Carter's escalating fury. The judge's words echoed off the high ceilings, each one a blow meant to humiliate. Yet Edward's silence only seemed to provoke Carter further. You stand there as if this is a game, the judge continued, his finger jabbing the air. Do you have any idea how many real cases this court handles? People with genuine hardships, people trying to rebuild their lives? And then we have you, taking pride in being a nuisance. Jennifer Lee cleared her throat, her voice tentative. Your Honor, if I may. Not now, Counselor, Carter interrupted, his hand raised without looking at her. I'm not finished with Mr. Harper. Before Edward's case could proceed further, Carter's attention shifted abruptly. Beliff, call the next case forward, he barked, as if eager to demonstrate his efficiency. Let's clear the docket before we waste more time. Mike Thompson stepped forward, his voice steady. Case number 52,842, State versus Marcus Reed, charge of petty theft. The courtroom doors opened again, and a young man in his early 20s shuffled in, his hands cuffed. Marcus Reed was thin, his clothes ill-fitting a stained hoodie and jeans that sagged at the waist. His dark eyes darted nervously around the room, settling briefly on Edward before dropping to the floor. The public defender, a harried woman in a rumpled suit, hurried to his side, whispering something in his ear. Carter barely glanced at the file. Mr. Reed, you're accused of stealing food from a convenience store on Broad Street. How do you plead? Marcus's voice was barely audible. Guilty, Your Honor. I was hungry. I didn't have money, And spare me the sob story, Carter cut in, his tone icy. The law doesn't care why you stole. You took what wasn't yours. This is your second offense, isn't it? The public defender spoke up. Your Honor, Mr. Reed is homeless and unemployed. He's willing to perform community service and— Carter raised a hand, silencing her. I've heard enough, Mr. Reed. This court has no patience for repeat offenders. You're sentenced to 60 days in county jail. Maybe that'll teach you to respect other people's property. Marcus's shoulders slumped, his eyes glistening as Mike Thompson led him away. The gallery fell silent, the weight of the sentence hanging in the air. Edward watched the young man go, his expression unreadable, but his jaw tightening slightly. Emily Brooks, seated in the gallery, scribbled a note, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jennifer Lee stared at her files, her knuckles white around. Her pen. Carter turned back to Edward, his irritation renewed. Now, Mr. Harper, where were we? Ah, yes, your blatant disregard for private property. He adjusted his glasses, a gesture that signaled another lecture. You know, when I was growing up, men of your generation valued responsibility, hard work, respect for the law. Yet here you stand, apparently having forgotten every one of those lessons. Edward's voice was quiet but steady. I haven't forgotten anything, Your Honor. I simply see the world differently. Differently? Carter's laugh was sharp, humorless. You see the world as your personal playground, Mr. Harper. You wander onto private estates, disrupt the lives of law-abiding citizens, and then stand here with that look on your face, as if you're above it all. The judge's voice rose, his words carrying a performative quality, as if he were addressing not just Edward, but the entire courtroom, perhaps society itself. This court sees real hardship. Every day. People who've made mistakes but are trying to do better. And then we have individuals like you, who seem to revel in defiance. Why couldn't you visit a public park? Are the public facilities not good enough for you? Edward's response was measured, almost gentle. Lakeside Manor holds a particular memory for me, Your Honor. My father worked there as a groundskeeper when I was young. We fished together every Sunday. Asterisk for a fleeting moment, something like hesitation flickered across Carter's face. But it vanished quickly, replaced by his customary sternness. Nostalgia is not a legal defense, Mr. Harper. Lakeside Manor has changed hands multiple times. It's now owned by people who have the right to enjoy their property without uninvited guests. I understand, Your Honor, Edward said, nodding. Carter's eyes flashed with frustration. I'm beginning to think you don't understand anything I'm saying. Perhaps a harsher penalty will drive the point home. He flipped through the case file again, muttering about repeat offenders and wasting the court's time. Looking up, he announced, given your prior offense and your clear lack of remorse, I'm inclined to sentence you to 30 days in county jail. Maybe that will teach you to respect other people's property. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Jennifer Lee stood, her voice urgent. Your Honor, the state was prepared to recommend community service. Given the non-violent nature of the offense and Mr. Harper's age, Carter fixed her with a cold stare. Thank you, Ms. Lee, but I believe I'm still the one wearing the robe in this courtroom. Edward's expression shifted, not to fear or anger, but to a curious amusement, as if he were privy to a secret no one else knew. Your Honor, he said, his voice suddenly stronger. Before you pass sentence, may I ask permission to make a phone call? Carter scoffed, his patience exhausted. A phone call? This isn't a TV drama, Mr. Harper. You should have made any calls before stepping into my courtroom. It'll only take a moment, Edward persisted. I'd like to inform my daughter, Lavra. She should know if I'm to be incarcerated. The judge rolled his eyes, his sarcasm thick. Fine. Aleph, allow Mr. Harper his call. Let's not add denied a phone call to whatever complaints he might file later. Mike Thompson approached Edward with a cell phone, his professional demeanor softening briefly as Edward thanked him with a genuine smile. Edward dialed a number from memory, his fingers nimble despite his age. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on him, curiosity replacing the earlier tension. After a brief pause, Edward spoke, his voice clear and precise. "Lavra, it's time. Bring the documents." He handed the phone back to Thompson, his posture straightening subtly. Turning to face Carter, Edward's eyes gleamed with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The judge's expression wavered, a mix of impatience and puzzlement. "Well, that was cryptic," Carter said, his voice sharp. "Are we supposed to be impressed?" Before Edward could respond, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. All heads turned, and Carter's words died in his throat. The clicking of heels against the marble floor grew louder, a purposeful rhythm that commanded attention. Edward's faint smile widened, and the courtroom braced for what was to come. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 5 swung open with a resounding thud, shattering the tense silence that had followed Edward Harper's cryptic phone call. The sharp, rhythmic click of heels against the marble floor echoed through the Richmond County Courthouse, each step a declaration of purpose. All heads turned, including Judge William Bill Carter's, whose scowl of irritation froze mid-expression. The air seemed to shift, charged with an electric anticipation that made even the most jaded spectators lean forward in their seats. A woman in her mid-40s strode down the center aisle, her charcoal gray suit impeccably tailored, its sharp lines accentuating her commanding presence. Her red designer heels, unmistakable to anyone versed in luxury fashion, punctuated each step with authority. Dark hair, pulled back in a sleek chignon, framed high cheekbones and piercing blue eyes, the same startling shade as Edward's. Behind her followed three men in equally pristine suits, their leather briefcases embossed with the logo of Bennett & Sullivan, one of Virginia's most prestigious law firms. Their collective entrance transformed the courtroom's atmosphere, like a storm front rolling in, heavy with unspoken consequences. Carter's mouth opened, then closed, his usual composure faltering. "Excuse me," he began, his voice strained. "This court is in session. Unless you have business with this case." "I have very specific business with this case, Your Honor," the woman interrupted, her voice clear and unyielding, cutting through the room like a blade. She didn't slow her pace as she approached the barrier separating the gallery from the court proper. Bailiff Mike Thompson hesitated, glancing at Carter for direction. The judge, momentarily flustered by the interruption, something he rarely experienced in his domain, gave a curt nod. The woman passed through the gate and walked directly to Edward, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The gesture was both protective and familiar, a silent reassurance that shifted the dynamic of the room. She turned to face the bench, her expression coolly professional, but with a simmering anger beneath the surface. "Lavra Harper, CEO of Harper Innovations," she announced, her voice carrying effortlessly. "I'm here regarding my father, Edward Harper, whom you've been publicly humiliating for the past half hour." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Carter's face, flushed with righteous indignation moments ago, drained of color, his gold-rimmed glasses slipping slightly down his nose. The gallery erupted into whispers, and even the court reporter's fingers hesitated over her stenotype. Machine. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Lee sat upright, her files forgotten, while Emily Brooks, the law student clerking for Carter, gripped her legal pad, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Miss Harper," Carter stammered, struggling to regain his footing. "This is highly irregular." "Court procedures." "I'm well aware of court procedures, Judge Carter," Lavra interrupted smoothly, her tone as sharp as her gaze. "Just as I'm aware of the Judicial Code of Conduct, which prohibits bias, prejudice, and the degradation of defendants based on perceived socioeconomic status. Her eyes narrowed, all of which have been on grotesque display in your courtroom today. One of the attorneys accompanying Laura stepped forward, placing a thick leather folio on the defense table. "Ms. Harper, the documents you requested," he said, his voice steady. Laura nodded without breaking eye contact with Carter. "Your Honor," she continued, "perhaps you'd care to review these materials before proceeding with your assessment of my father." Carter's eyes darted between Laura, Edward, and the folio, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his gavel, then thought better of it. "Court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced abruptly, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I don't believe that's necessary." "Your Honor," Laura replied, her tone unyielding, "unless you need time to compose yourself. After realizing you spent the morning berating one of Virginia's most respected business leaders and philanthropists." Asterisk. The gallery buzzed with excitement, the whispers growing into a low roar. Carter banged his gavel, the sound sharper and more desperate than usual. "Order!" he barked, though his voice wavered. Edward stood quietly beside his daughter, a faint, enigmatic smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had yet to speak since Laura's entrance, content to let the scene unfold. "Ms. Harper," Carter tried again, his tone conciliatory, "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding. Had I known your father's identity—" "That's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Laura cut him off, her voice like ice. She turned slightly, addressing the courtroom at large. "The fact that his treatment would have been different. Had you known who he is, that's why we're here today." The judge's confusion was palpable. "I don't understand." Laura signaled to one of her attorneys, who produced a small digital recorder from his briefcase. "With your permission, Your Honor," she said, though her tone suggested permission was a formality. "I'd like to play something for the court." Before Carter could respond, Edward finally spoke, his voice stronger now, stripped of the frail humility he'd affected earlier. "It's time, Laura. Let them understand." The transformation in Edward's demeanor was striking. Gone was the stooped, weathered old man. In his place stood a figure of quiet authority, his posture straight, his blue eyes blazing with purpose. Several spectators leaned forward, trying to reconcile this new Edward with the defendant they'd seen moments ago. Carter's expression shifted from confusion to dread, as if sensing the ground beneath him crumbling. Laura pressed a button on the recorder, and Carter's voice filled the courtroom, each word a damning echo of his earlier tirade. "Look at yourself. Patch jacket, worn-out jeans. Is this how you present yourself to the world? There are shelters, Mr. Harper. Programs for people in your situation." The recording continued, capturing his most caustic remarks. "You're a burden on society. A man who takes pride in being a nuisance." With each played statement, Carter seemed to shrink behind his bench, his face turning ashen. The gallery was silent, the weight of the judge's words now turned against him. When the recording ended, Edward stepped forward, his voice cultured and articulate, bearing no trace of the humble tone he'd used before. "For those who don't recognize my name," he began, addressing the courtroom with a calm authority, "I am Edward Harper, founder of Harper Innovations, a company I built 45 years ago after serving as an engineer with NASA during the Apollo program. I hold 18 patents, sit on the boards of 7 Fortune 500 companies. And yes," he gestured to his worn clothes, "I sometimes dress like this." He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom remained still, every eye fixed on him. "Twice a year, for the past decade, I've conducted what my daughter calls my social experiments. I shed my usual life, remove all identification, and live for 2 weeks as someone with limited means. I ride public buses, eat at soup kitchens, And, yes, occasionally visit places from my childhood, like Lakeside Manor. Carter's hands gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. Edward continued, his voice steady but piercing. I do this because I believe character isn't determined by circumstances but revealed by them. When people think you have nothing, no money, no power, no influence, they show you who they truly are. His gaze locked onto Carter. Some show compassion. Others, like you, Your Honor, show contempt. Lavra stepped forward, holding up the digital recorder. My father called me because we had an agreement. If he ever encountered true injustice, during one of his experiments, he would contact me to document it. Today's display of judicial misconduct certainly qualifies. One of the attorneys handed her a document, which she passed to Mike Thompson to deliver to the judge. This is a notice of our intent to file a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Committee, Lavra explained as Carter scanned the paper, his hands visibly shaking. The recording, along with the court transcript and witness statements, will be submitted as evidence. Carter placed the document down carefully, as if it might burn him. Ms. Harper, Mr. Harper, he said, his voice a shadow of its former bombast. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. On the contrary, Edward replied, his tone resolute. I understand perfectly. You saw an old man in warm clothes and assumed he was worthless. You used your position to humiliate someone you thought couldn't fight back. There's no misunderstanding, just an uncomfortable truth about your character, laid bare for all to see. The gallery was now a sea of whispers. Several spectators pulling out their phones despite courthouse rules, their fingers tapping furiously. Among them was Natalie Hayes, a freelance journalist in her early 30s, seated near the back. Her sharp eyes had caught every detail of the proceedings, and her thumbs flew across her phone screen, posting live updates to her social media. Followers. Breaking. Billionaire Edward Harper exposes judicial bias in Richmond courtroom. Judge Carter humiliated after mistaking him for a vagrant. Hashtag Justice for Harper. Her posts, tagged with the courthouse's location, began to spread. Likes and retweets climbing by the second. Outside, the ripple effect was already taking hold. Natalie's followers shared her updates, and within minutes, local news outlets picked up the story. A crowd of reporters began gathering on the courthouse steps, alerted by the viral buzz. Inside, Emily Brooks, the law student, opened her phone under her legal pad, drafting a post of her own. Witnessed something extraordinary in court today. A judge's bias exposed, a billionaire's humility revealed. This is why we need reform. Hashtag Justice for Harper. Her words, though less polished than Natalie's, carried the raw passion of someone who'd seen the system's flaws up close. Jennifer Lee, still at the prosecution table, exchanged a glance with one of her colleagues. Her expression a mix of shock and quiet approval. Mike Thompson, standing near Edward, allowed a flicker of a smile to cross his face, quickly masked by his professional demeanor. The courtroom was no longer Carter's domain. It belonged to Edward and Lavra, whose presence had turned a routine hearing into a seismic event. Laura turned to her father, her voice softer but still firm. Dad, are you ready to take this outside? Edward nodded, his smile now unmistakable. Let's show them what justice looks like when it's held accountable. Carter, his authority in tatters, stared at the document on his bench, the words blurring before his eyes. Mr. Harper, he said weakly, I had no idea who you were. And that, Edward said, his voice ringing with quiet power, is why this matters. In your courtroom, respect isn't a right. It's a privilege reserved for those with wealth or status. He turned to Emily in the gallery, his gaze steady. The true measure of justice isn't how it treats the powerful, but how it treats the powerless. The courtroom fell silent, the ticking of the hallway's grandfather clock audible through the closed doors. Carter sat motionless, the color draining from his face as the magnitude of his misstep became clear. Jennifer Lee rose, her voice cutting through the hush. Your Honor, in light of these revelations, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Harper immediately. Carter managed a nod, his voice barely audible. Motion granted. Laura signaled to her legal team, who began gathering their materials. We're not done yet, Your Honor, she said, her tone a promise of more to come. As Edward and Laura prepared to leave, Natalie Hayes slipped out a side door, her phone already buzzing with notifications. The world outside was waking up to the story unfolding in Courtroom 5, and it was about to explode. The massive oak doors of the Richmond County Courthouse groaned open, releasing Edward Harper, Laura Harper, and a visibly shaken Judge William Bill Carter into a maelstrom of camera flashes and shouted questions. The courthouse steps, bathed in the golden light of a late April afternoon, had transformed into a chaotic stage. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones thrusting forward like spears, while smartphones waved in the air, capturing what was already being dubbed a viral moment. The hashtag Justice for Harper trended across social media, fueled by Natalie Hayes' live updates and Emily Brooks' passionate post from inside Courtroom 5. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, sensing that the drama unfolding within the marble walls was about to spill into the public square. Edward walked with a confident stride, his faded flannel shirt and frayed jeans no longer a mark of frailty, but a symbol of his deliberate disguise. The stooped posture he'd affected in court was gone, replaced by the bearing of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms. Laura, her charcoal gray suit pristine and her red heels clicking with purpose, matched his pace, her expression a blend of pride and vigilance. Carter trailed behind, his black judicial robe dragging like a weight, his salt and pepper hair disheveled. His gray eyes, once sharp with authority, now darted nervously across the sea of reporters, as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Mr. Harper, is it true you're worth billions? A reporter shouted. Judge Carter, will you resign? Another called. Ms. Harper, was this a planned sting? A third voice demanded. Edward raised a hand, and to the crowd's surprise, the clamor subsided. His simple gesture radiating a natural authority honed over decades as a tech pioneer. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the steps. For those who don't know me, I am Edward Harper, founder of Harper Innovations. A murmur rippled through the crowd as reporters scribbled notes and cameras zoomed in. Edward gestured to his worn clothes, his blue eyes twinkling with purpose. Today, I appeared in court dressed as you see me now, not out of necessity, but by choice. For the past 10 years, twice annually, I've stepped out of my usual life to experience society from a different perspective, without the privileges wealth provides. He paused, letting his words settle. The reporters hung on, his every syllable, their pens and devices capturing a story that was already reshaping public discourse. What I experienced in Courtroom 5 was, unfortunately, not unusual. Across this country, people are judged not by their character or merit of their cases, but by their clothing, their bank accounts, their perceived status. Laura stood proudly beside her father, her presence a silent endorsement of his mission. Carter, however, seemed to shrink further into his robe, his face pale as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. Edward continued, his voice steady but forceful. This isn't about one courtroom or one judge. It's about a system that too often fails those who need it most. But today presents an opportunity for change. He turned toward Carter, extending a hand in a gesture that stunned the onlookers. That's why I've asked Judge Carter to join me here. The crowd fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of camera shutters. Carter hesitated, his hands trembling as he stepped forward. The contrast was striking. Edward, in his shabby clothes, radiated dignity, while Carter, in his formal robes, appeared diminished, a man stripped of his armor. "Judge Carter has agreed to address you," Edward announced. "Not because I demanded it, but because acknowledging our mistakes publicly is the first step toward meaningful change." Carter cleared his throat twice, his voice shaky as he began. "What happened in my courtroom today was inexcusable." The words seemed to pain him, each one a confession wrung from a man unaccustomed to humility. "I failed to uphold the most basic principle of justice, that all who enter a courtroom deserve dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived status." A hush settled over the crowd. No one could recall a sitting judge making such a public admission. Carter's hands gripped the edges of his robe, his knuckles white. "I allowed prejudice to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I betrayed my oath as a judge. Mr. Harper, I offer you my sincere apology. But more importantly, I extend that apology to every person who has stood before me and received less than the impartial justice they deserved." Edward nodded, his expression solemn but encouraging. A reporter pushed forward, her voice cutting through the silence. "Judge Carter, are you saying this because you got caught, or because you genuinely believe you were wrong?" Carter flinched, the question striking like a dart. He glanced at Edward, who offered no assistance, his blue eyes steady but neutral. "I'm saying it," Carter finally responded, his voice steadier now, "because today I saw myself through others' eyes for the first time, and I didn't like what I saw." The admission hung in the air, raw and unpolished. Edward stepped forward, his voice warm but resolute. "Thank you, Judge Carter. Acknowledgement is the first step toward change." He turned back to the reporters. "I didn't orchestrate today's events to embarrass one judge or gain publicity. I did it to highlight a systemic problem that affects thousands everyday people who don't have the resources to fight back." Laura moved to her father's side, handing out press packets prepared by her legal team. "Harper Innovations is establishing the Equal Justice Project," she announced, her voice clear and commanding. "With an initial funding commitment of $50 million, the project will provide legal representation for low-income defendants and advocate for nationwide courtroom reforms." The crowd erupted into murmurs, reporters scrambling to capture the details. Edward noticed Emily Brooks standing at the edge of the gathering, her legal pad clutched to her chest. He gestured for her to join them. "This is Emily Brooks," he introduced, his voice carrying a note of pride. "A law student who had the courage to speak truth to power today. The Equal Justice Project will include a fellowship program for students like Miss Brooks, who are committed to building a more equitable legal system." Emily blushed, her conservative blazer and nervous smile contrasting with the confidence of her earlier social media post. "Thank you, Mr. Harper," she said softly, her voice gaining strength. "What happened today showed me why we need to keep fighting for justice." As the press conference continued, Carter leaned closer to Edward, his voice low, meant only for him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, bewilderment in his eyes. "You could have destroyed me completely. Why offer me any chance at redemption?" Edward studied the judge's face, his expression sincere. "Because this was never about you, Judge Carter. It's about the thousands who enter courtrooms every day without the power to defend themselves against bias. If your public accountability helps change that, even a little, then today's theatrics were worth it." Carter nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I never saw them," he admitted quietly. "All these years on the bench, and I never really saw the people standing before me." "Now you do," Edward replied simply. "The question is what you'll do with that awareness." Laura, noticing the crowd's growing restlessness, stepped forward to wrap up the event. "That's all for today," she said, her tone professional but firm. "A formal press conference will be held next week with more details about the Equal Justice Project." Her team guided Edward toward a waiting town car, a stark contrast to the public bus he'd arrived on that morning. Down as they reached the vehicle, Edward paused, turning back to the steps. Carter still stood there, alone now, his robe fluttering in the breeze. Their eyes met across the distance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Edward gave a small nod before sliding into the car, the door closing with a solid thud. The RD. Reporters dispersed, their stories already flooding the internet. Natalie Hayes' posts had garnered millions of views, and Emily's heartfelt message was shared by advocacy groups across the country. Inside the courthouse, Jennifer Lee gathered, her files, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd witnessed. Mike Thompson, locking up Courtroom 5, allowed himself a rare smile, replaying Edward's calm defiance in his mind. Later that evening, Emily Brooks sat in a quiet coffee shop near the courthouse, her laptop open. She drafted an email to Edward, her fingers trembling with determination. "Dear Mr. Harper," she wrote, "I grew up in a neighborhood where justice was a luxury, not a right. Today, you showed me that one person can change the system. I'd be honored to join the Equal Justice Project and carry forward what you started." She hit send, then opened her social media, where her post about the day's events had gone viral. Comments poured in, from law students to activists, all inspired by the story of an old man in warm clothes who'd turned a courtroom upside down. Emily smiled, her nervousness replaced by a quiet resolve. She wasn't just a clerk anymore. She was part of something bigger. Meanwhile, Carter returned to his chambers, the silence oppressive after the chaos of the day. He sank into his leather chair, the complaint from Laura's team lying on his desk like a judgment. His colleagues had avoided him in the halls, their whispers trailing in his wake. Opening his laptop, he searched for articles on implicit bias, his fingers hesitating over the keys. The titles stared back at him: How Judges' Prejudices Shape Sentencing, The Cost of Bias in the Courtroom. For the first time in years, Carter felt the weight of his robe not as power, but as responsibility. He opened a blank document and began typing a letter to the Judicial Conduct Committee, his words slow but deliberate. "I request a review of my conduct and commit to any retraining necessary." Outside, the city pulsed with the story of Edward Harper, the billionaire who'd walked among the powerless to expose the powerful. The courthouse steps, now empty, stood as a silent witness to a moment that would echo far beyond Richmond, a spark that promised to ignite change. 3 months later, Edward Harper sat in his penthouse office atop the Harper Innovations Tower, the Richmond skyline sprawling beneath a summer sky. Gone were the faded flannel and frayed jeans of his courtroom disguise. He now wore a tailored navy suit, his white hair neatly trimmed, his posture commanding at 76. The mahogany desk before him was strewn with newspapers, their headlines unanimous: Harper Justice Act signed into law, Billionaire's Experiment sparks courtroom reform, Virginia leads nation in judicial overhaul. The legislation, a landmark achievement, mandated implicit bias training for judges, established an independent review board for courtroom complaints, and expanded legal aid for low-income defendants. Its passage, remarkably swift for a state legislature known for gridlock, was a testament to the viral outrage, sparked by Edward's courtroom stand and the $50 million pledged to the Equal Justice Project. Lavra Harper entered without knocking, a tablet in hand, her charcoal gray suit as sharp as ever. "It's official," she announced, a note of triumph in her voice. "The governor signed the act this morning. Courthouse procedures across Virginia will never be the same." Edward smiled, picking up a newspaper. Amazing what can happen in 3 months when the right pressure is applied. And when you have a viral video, public outrage, and $50 million behind you, Lavra added, settling into the leather chair opposite his desk. She scrolled through her tablet, her expression softening. The fellowship applications are pouring in. Over 600 law students. Emily Brooks is heading the selection committee. She's a natural leader. Edward nodded, his thoughts drifting to the young woman who'd approached him on the courthouse steps. Emily Brooks, once a nervous law student, had become the face of the Equal Justice Project's youth initiative, her viral post and passionate advocacy resonating with a generation hungry for change. She's proof that one voice can shift the tide, Edward said. From a clerk to a catalyst in 3 months. Laura's smile faded slightly. I'm still not entirely convinced about your approach with Carter. Giving him a platform, letting him redeem himself, it's a risk. Edward leaned back, his blue eyes distant. Sometimes the most powerful advocates for change are those who face their own flaws head-on. Carter's journey isn't over, but it's begun. The conversation paused as Edward's gaze settled on a framed photograph on his desk. A young boy fishing with his father at Lakeside Manor, the lake shimmering under a long-ago sun. The memory pulled him back, and he stood, adjusting his tie. I need to make a stop before the press conference, he said, checking his watch. Have James bring the car around. An hour later, Edward stood on the newly renovated fishing pier at Lakeside Manor, the tranquil water reflecting the late afternoon light. He had traded his suit for comfortable jeans and a flannel shirt, chosen now for comfort rather than disguise. The estate, which he'd purchased 6 months ago through a holding company, was no longer a gated enclave for the elite, but a community space, its grounds open to local families. The pier where he'd been arrested for trespassing, the spark that ignited a movement stretched out before him, a quiet reminder of how far one moment could carry. Laura joined him, her heels clicking softly on the wooden planks. Dad, your press conference is in an hour. What are you doing out here? Edward gestured to the lake, his voice soft. Remembering why we do what we do. He pointed to a spot near the shore. My father and I fished right there every Sunday when he was the groundskeeper. He taught me something on this pier. The measure of a person isn't what they own or the title they hold. It's how they treat those who can offer them nothing. In return, Laura slipped her arm through his, her expression softening. Is that why you bought this place? Nostalgia? Partly, Edward admitted. But also as a reminder. In all my years building companies and technologies, nothing has matched the satisfaction of these past 3 months. Not because it's personal, but because it's universal. Technology changes how we live. Justice changes who we are as a society. They stood in silence, the ripples on the lake carrying the weight of their words. Edward cast one last glance at the water, the echoes of his social experiment now etched into laws, lives, and a nation's conscience. As they turned to leave, he smiled. Sometimes, the most powerful changes begin with a single moment when we see ourselves as we truly are. Across town, in a modest conference room, William Carter stood before a group of judges attending a workshop on implicit bias. His judicial robes were gone, replaced by a conservative gray suit. The past 3 months had aged him visibly deep. Lines etched around his eyes, his hair more silver than salt and pepper, but there was a new humility in his posture, a watchfulness that suggested he no longer took anything for granted. As a consultant for the Equal Justice Project, he shared his story, his voice steady but raw. I sentenced hundreds over the years, he said, but it was Edward Harper who sentenced me to awareness, to seeing the people I'd overlooked. Justice isn't power. It's responsibility. The story of Edward Harper and William Carter is more than a courtroom drama. It's a testament to the power of empathy, accountability, and redemption. Edward's choice to live as the powerless revealed a universal truth. Character is defined by how we treat those who seem insignificant. His refusal to destroy Carter, instead offering him a path to change, underscores the humanist belief that even those who err can grow if given the chance. Carter's journey from arrogance to humility reminds us that confronting our flaws is the first step toward meaningful reform. For every Edward who can expose injustice, there are countless others who suffer in silence, and this story challenges us to see them, to act, to build a world where justice is truly blind. The Harper Justice Act and the Equal Justice Project are beacons of hope, proving that one moment of truth can ripple into systemic change. If this story moved you, subscribe to Legacy Stories for more tales of courage, transformation, and the human spirit. From unsung heroes to pivotal moments that reshape society, our channel brings you narratives that inspire and challenge. Click the subscribe button and join our community to never miss a story that matters. Together, let's celebrate the legacies that change the world.